Do you see AI running businesses from the top?
That's an AI question.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Tea Talks. My name is Rupert Younger and I've been here at Oxford for 16 years. The centre that I lead studies social evaluations, in particular 6 really important concepts. They are legitimacy, status, stigma, celebrity, reputation and trust.
And I'm Rachel Botsman, and I have been studying trust for over 15 years now. I teach at the school and I write books, and I'm fundamentally interested in the way that trust is changing in society. So the changing dynamics of trust and how that impacts our lives.
So you can see the connecting thread here between us, and we're here today to talk specifically about the changing nature of AI. In particular, AI as perhaps more than just a technology. But in addition to that, we're going to get into humanness. We're going to get into trust more generally in technology. So we've got a lot to talk about.
Yes.
Let me start off, if I can, Rachel, by putting to you the question that I wrote about, which is that AI has become more than just a technology. It has earned the right to now be treated as a stakeholder. But essentially the narrative is this, which is that AI, in particular generative AI, now creates stuff. It's no longer pattern recognition AI, it's creating new materials. If something creates new materials and develops new information, that thing could be a journalist. That thing could be a politician. It could be any form of human actor who's in the business of creation. So the point was that AI as generative AI, in that it's creating new stuff, perhaps it's time to think of it not just as a technology, but to govern it inside organizations as a stakeholder. And of course, that leads to different types of engagement. What it means is that you no longer have AI, the preserve of the IT department or indeed the IT director, but that you put it into the corporate affairs space where perhaps you have strategies to engage with the training data sets that underpin how these large language models and the AI is developed. Perhaps you also speak to the algorithm developers to persuade them to think about designing things differently. And you could certainly think about working to shape some of the outputs that come out. So the idea of treating it as a standard stakeholder would be treated because it's in the content creation business.
Interesting. Okay, so because that's what I was trying to get at when I read the paper is what is the intention behind this? But it's, I guess, how you treat it within the context of an organization and how that's different from some kind of neutral technology.
Yeah, and it's a really super point you make, because what we're not trying to get into, I don't think anyone actually wants to listen to, is a deep philosophical thing about intent and consciousness. What we're really trying to do is to get into the practical questions of, as a leader, as an organization, how should you engage with something that is a content creator?
Interesting. So, because I think stakeholders in themselves is an interesting concept, right? So if you think about, I'm always interested in sort of the history of words. And I mean, it came from gambling, to have a stake, to have an interest in something. Now, I know you don't want to talk about feelings and intentions. And I'd love to believe that AI could be a stakeholder. But I do have an issue with this because it is an issue of accountability. And I think this is where we come back to the trust piece. So I really struggle whether we trust someone or something. I think we trust both. But if you think of the someone as a who and the something as a what, I think we run into trouble when the what isn't tied to a who. And I would argue that we treat AI and AI will think it's a who, but fundamentally it's still a what. Now, when we lose that connection, when the what is no longer tied to the who, a real person, we've seen this before, right? We've seen this when we made corporations entities. You end up with issues of accountability. we've seen this with Facebook, right? When something goes wrong, when there's a trust crisis, they point to the algorithm versus individuals.
Right.
So that is my issue with the stake. I think where you're coming from is you're actually saying, well, this increases AI stakes in the organization, so therefore treat it in this way. But I worry that it becomes then a point of deferral of blame and accountability when things go wrong.
So in the trust literature, let me try and pick up on this very interesting who and what idea, because I agree with you. It's hard to think of a non-human object as being something that is worthy of trust or indeed being dealt with as a stakeholder. The trust literature tends to talk about, well, this goes back to a 1995 paper with Davis and Shulman, who talked about this ABI framework that you know so well, which is that the three driving moderators of trust are ability, benevolence, and integrity. And they map onto quite a lot of the work that we've done and I've written about, which is this dual dimensionality of reputation and social evaluation, perceptions of capability and perceptions of character. And you've also written about this in your excellent Rachel's Rethink, plug for Rachel's Rethink, by the way. It's an excellent thing to look at and engage with. So this idea of capability and character, I think, leads us to some way to make sense of this what and who. Because I think we can start to think about the what in a normative way. So we might start to think that the capability of a nation state like Germany to be a high engineering, highly capable nation state. That perception, I think, can lead us to trust German companies for being highly capable. But when you come to character, which is the who, I think it's much, much harder to then think about inanimate objects. So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit to suggest that there is a framework where the what can be evaluated and thought about in those type of frames of trust.
Yeah. And this, I guess, is where AI is different, right? So to give a really simple example, in the past, let's take a bridge, right?
Yeah.
Now, I would say there is trust in a bridge, right?
But it's not going to fall when
it's
you
not
go
going to
over
fall,
it.
right? So I'm going to walk over it. But fundamentally, if that bridge does break, the person I don't hold the bridge accountable.
Right.
I hold the engineers or the company that installed that bridge. So I would argue the bridge has capability traits. It's competent and it's reliable, but the people have the character traits.
Yeah.
And you may have read somewhere, but I haven't yet seen anything that has convinced me that we should assess AI against the same traits as a human when it comes to trustworthiness.
Right.
So the competence and reliability, yes. Empathy, I think, yes. But it's this integrity piece that I really struggle with.
But what happens when AI starts to become very smart, which it's already doing in lots of different ways, and it's already and it takes decisions which are automated decisions, but they're not conscious, but they are processed by learning from humans. So they're adapting human kind of reactions to become their own, not human entity, but decision-making entity. And can they therefore be held accountable? Let me give you an example. If all of our cars have headlights that then, or modern cars have headlights that then go when they're on full beam, they go off full beam when you come and it sees other lights coming up. What if that car gets it wrong, right? So the AI somehow mistakes it wrong and it doesn't dip your lights and it causes a crash. So who's responsible for that? Who's accountable for that? Is it the designers of the AI system? I'm not sure it is, because it works in the majority of cases. But the accountability for that surely has to rest somewhere. And it's really down to the particular glitch in the algorithm, which makes the what accountable, not the who.
But how are you going to take a thing that doesn't have a body and it doesn't have a soul? Well, you
can't take it to court.
You can't take it to court.
But that's different to accountability, because I can hold the AI mistake accountable in my mind. I can't legally. I'd have to sue the company or the individual, if I was going the legal route for retribution, but I can hold it accountable, surely.
But what happens with that account? So for me, accountability is there has to be a change in the behavior, right? So accountability is only useful if it leads to something, right? So there has to be a penalty or a fine. There has to be a systems change. In some way, accountability, well, in many ways, accountability is putting the measures and changes in place that prevent something happening again. It's not just about assigning blame or punishment. And I think this is where we've gone wrong so many times with technology, right? It's like, oh, you're accountable, pay the fine and move on. Or in finance and banking, the way we've thought about that. I think we can learn a lot from the way we thought about the corporation as an entity and how that's led to all kinds of issues with accountability. So I do struggle with the fact that you can't take it to court. So in that sense, I would say the AI is to blame in terms of the design flaw, but the AI is not going to stand up and say, fix me.
No, but you probably could then also get behind the idea that as a sense-making exercise, the organizations who built that original technology would go, something's gone wrong.
Yes.
It's not a question of them being held to account and being put in the court of law, but as a sense-making exercise, they're going, okay, the accountability for this lies in the problem of the what, not the who.
Yes.
And therefore, we as the who have to re-engage to change the what.
There might be a slightly different way of thinking about this.
Yeah.
So as you know, I think about trust dynamics, right? So I think about flows of trust. And so bear with me while I sort of back up. So, there's this argument that trust is in a state of decline. And I think that's the wrong way to think about trust, that actually trust is like energy. It doesn't get destroyed, it changes form. And what's happened is we've moved through these, what I call trust shifts. So local, institutional, distributed, and now what I would call auto-sapient is the next chapter. Now, where this gets interesting and relates to what we're talking about is the institutional phase of trust was really easy to understand in many ways, because if you think about trust in terms of a direction of flow, the arrow went upwards.
Yeah.
Right. So
hierarchical trust.
Point to the people in charge, point to the experts, linear, very centralized, easy to know who to hold account. That got blown up with sort of the first big wave of technology. So you look at networks and marketplaces and platforms distributed, right? The trust then flowed sideways.
And this is more the concept of horizontal trust, where you trust people who look and feel like you, and you therefore think they might be more relevant to you. Is that right?
Yeah, it could be that people no longer, example of the shift, that people no longer turn on the 6 o'clock news, they go onto TikTok to find their information, that you no longer get into a license cab, you get into an Uber, that you no longer take money from a bank, you use a cryptocurrency, right? So this went this, and this is complicated enough to get our heads around, because we've seen, with Sam Bankman-Fried, what happens when there is no center, when there is no institution.
Yeah.
Now, so if you imagine upwards, sideways, and now when I think about artificial intelligence, I think that trust then becomes a through trust. So there becomes no distinction between the human and the artificially intelligent thing in terms of the information and decision making, right? It's just an extension of who we are. That's hard to imagine right now, because most of us use AI as a tool, right? It's a thing that sits on our desktop. It's not an extension of ourselves. But I think that's 10 years off. So that's what I cannot get my head around, is that it's not about the lights on the car, which is sort of a self-contained object. It's when we're using artificial intelligence as an extension of our decision making, where it becomes almost impossible to separate, who are you trusting? Are you trusting me, Rachel? Are you trusting the AI tool that I'm using? Or are you trusting my application and usage of that? All of that gets completely messed up. Does that make sense? That's the part that I worry about.
Yeah, so you're arguing in a sense for a different approach to this ABI or capability character, where you're saying that humans and humanity are at the core of this.
Yes.
And I agree with you. I mean, we've just come from class where we've been talking a lot about the power of humanity in a technology age, the outsized power of humanity in a technology age. And your argument seems to fit with that, this idea that humans are at the center of it and that technology is a transmission mechanism.
Yes. Yes. And I would say that, it's interesting. You spend a lot of time with business leaders, and I thought the World Economic Forum this year should have been called WAIF, the World Artificial Intelligence, for like the obsession around this topic. It's so noisy. And I worry it's become a distraction away from the thing that seems to be emerging as the most important thing to people, which is people.
Which is people. Yeah.
Which I think is, with this world of efficiency and automation and convenience, we've experienced it at such an accelerated speed that we are waking up, and we've both said this in class, right? It's the first time I've had students say, what about people?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, yes, what about people? What about meeting up in the real world? What about that human factor? And so how that becomes the point of differentiation, that these organizations that actually say, no, there is a person that you can point to. There is a person when you run into trouble. To me, that is actually going to become the differentiator. That is going to be the thing that people trust.
So that's a hopeful note on which for us to bring in our questions, because I think we've got here a series of questions that have come from, just to make everyone, so we don't know what these questions are, just to make sure everyone knows that there's not.
You can trust us on that, right? I think.
Yes, we're human. Take your pick.
Okay.
And I think the deal is you ask me a question from this and I ask you a question.
And we don't know.
I'm going to pick one too.
We don't know which one's been written by the AI and which one's been, is that right?
No, you're completely right. I think some are AI written and some are not.
Okay. Oh, well, there's a question I had for you. So if AI is a stakeholder, what do you do when it misbehaves? So how do you hold AI accountable?
So how do you hold it to account? So again, the answer in the paper was that you treat it as a stakeholder, and when it misbehaves, you identify the mechanisms through which you can influence it. So if it's behaved badly because of bias, you would go and talk about the training data and point out the training data that it's been developed on is biased, and maybe they should retrain it, refocus it, and redevelop it. If it's an algorithm problem, speak to the designer and say, actually, you've developed this in the wrong way. You've asked the wrong questions. You put the wrong code in the wrong order. So the typical stakeholder responses.
Interesting. So I think now I understand what you're saying about treat it as a stakeholder, because then when it misbehaves, you don't look at the outcome. You look at the input, right? You go back to the root.
And it's a set of managerial to-dos. I think often what we talk about in academia a lot is big themes and concepts, but it's that final translation as to, okay, I get the point, but what do I now do differently that I wouldn't have done before I knew that? And I think what I'm trying to get across is that managers have maybe more agency over generative AI than they think.
So that's interesting. So I think I'd fallen in the trap of thinking this through a philosophical frame, but now I'm putting sort of a board hat on, and I can see how this would change the conversations.
Right. Okay, I have one for you. Do you see AI running businesses from the top?
That's an AI question. Do I see AI running businesses from
the top? In other words, being the CEO.
Yeah, it's such a phrasing, right? It's like that they would be.
That's definitely an AI question.
Yeah, in charge. Yes, I do.
So an AI CEO, you think that we could have an AI CEO?
I think that probably within the next year, probably Reid Hoffman will create it because he likes to do these types of things. But yeah, I can see particularly in the context of finance, where we know that AI, not just information, but decision-making can be superior to a human, that taking out the human altogether, that it's a fully run AI corporation. I think that's within less than a year would be my prediction.
I would agree, but not a CEO. I think from the top, I think there could be a COO, a chief operating officer, because systems, patterns, processes, procedures, repeats, all of that can be done, I think, quite well. But if you're a CEO and you have to be accountable, I'm going to play it back
I'm not saying it'd be
now.
right. I'm saying it's going to happen. Yeah.
So I think a CEO, no. Okay, we have two more questions.
Okay.
Pick your pick.
Oh, I think this one's AI too. But what are the ethical considerations surrounding AI's role as a
Wow, that's a big question.
It is.
So I'm gonna answer this by saying that I think one of the biggest challenges and problems and gaps in the debates about AI is that the question of what should AI be allowed to do has not been given nearly enough time.
Yes.
Everyone's focused on what AI can do, the technical abilities of AI, and the amazing things and applications that have emerged. But the question of what should AI be allowed to do has been under-questioned, under-explored, and is an absolutely urgent, imminent priority, I think, for us.
It's so interesting. So you do a lot when companies are in a crisis, right? That's when they come to you. And I get it when it's in a trust crisis. And the conversation that never seems to happen is not what should we do, but what should we not do?
Yeah.
That's where they run into trouble, right? So it's the client we shouldn't have taken, the conflict of interest, the piece of information we shouldn't release, the way we shouldn't have behaved, right? It's not in the things that we should do. And I don't know whether this is human behavior that we don't think about that question, but you're absolutely right. Like it's all about giving AI permission, looking at what it's capable of, the possibilities. And then I think when we talk about, then it becomes a conversation of restraint or constraint versus context by context, right? Healthcare, what should it not do?
Defense.
Defense.
What should it not do? I think defense is one of the most urgent and pressing questions around ethical uses and deployment of AI.
And it's interesting. So my husband's a lawyer, and it's fascinating how quickly it's changing, that the judges are doing U-turns.
Yeah.
So I think it was a year ago, they said, no, you cannot use AI to write any kind of legal brief or synopsis.
Yeah.
And that's now done a U-turn because actually, if you think of the Panama Papers, it's phenomenal at going through data. One of the things I think I underestimated with AI, which I now would say is an integrated part of my workflow, is how it is a source of inspiration and creative stimulus. So, I use Midjourney a lot to take ideas and turn them into images, and it takes my work into a different direction. So I started to think about, like, how far is this from someone being nudged into doing something they never would have morally done, right? That it's always making, you see how it's a therapist, you see how it's an advisor, and then in court, your defense would be, well, it wasn't me, Your Honor.
Yeah. It was the nudge from the AI.
Yeah. And that's another really interesting ethical question.
I agree. Now, it falls to you to answer the last question.
Okay.
Here it comes. What can leaders do to ensure transparency and fairness when AI is making the decisions?
Okay. Well, the question includes one of my least favorite words, not fairness. I like the word fairness.
But transparency.
I hate the word transparency.
No, we talked a lot about this in the past.
I think it's where we've gone so wrong with trust, and I really worry that we're holding it up again as the savior.
Well, you've made a point fairly consistently that sometimes transparency can lead to mis or distrust, not to more trust.
Yeah, it backfires. So, as you know, the way I define trust is it's a confident relationship with the unknown. So if you need to make things visible, if you need to see how exactly something works, you've sort of given up on trust. So transparency doesn't increase trust. It reduces the need for trust. And the greater the complexity or unknown in a system, the more trust that you need. So I just, with this idea with transparency, like, we can't understand we can't get inside the visibility of these systems. I understand where people are coming from. Even transparency around the data sets. It's the scale and complexity of these things where I just don't think transparency is the answer. So again, I think transparency is very effective when we are using it as a tool to shine a light on something that can be disclosed, right? So it's around a discrete problem that then will generate accountability and change. So I think some of the issues around copyright, really interesting to apply transparency. So it's not that I'm against transparency, but it's not going to fix this problem. And then even fairness has become another confused concept, right, in the corporate lexicon in terms of what is fairness. It doesn't mean treating everyone equally. And how you actually, I think fairness is one of the easiest design problems to solve for in how you weight data sets and how that can influence outcomes.
Right.
So that one I think is achievable, but not transparency.
Right. Very interesting. So that concludes this episode of Tea Talks. If you've enjoyed this, do come back and watch all the other really interesting episodes that are there for you to enjoy.